Most people think they know what the Bible says about divorce, and most people are wrong. What if the very institution meant to protect love had been turned into a tool of power, convenience, and political survival long before Jesus ever spoke a word about it? Here is the uncomfortable truth. Divorce in Jesus' time was not a last resort for broken people. For many, it was a casual option, dressed in religious language, debated by scholars, weaponized by kings, and handed to women like a receipt of rejection. Jesus did not just offer a new rule on the subject. He detonated a theological bomb in the middle of centuries of compromise. And what he said, and why he said it, will change the way you see marriage, covenant, and what it means to keep a promise forever. Before anyone ever signed a contract, before any court ruled on a divorce, before Shammai and Hillel ever argued about the grounds for separation, marriage already existed, and it was stunning. The creation design was not born in a legal office or a religious institution. It was born in a garden, in the very breath of God, when he looked at everything he had made and said it was good. From the very beginning, the union between a man and a woman was meant to be a covenant, not a temporary arrangement, not a trial run, but a permanent bond woven into the fabric of creation itself. When Genesis says male and female, he created them, it is not writing a policy manual. It is describing something sacred, something that predates every law ever written. Think of it like the foundation of a house. The house can be renovated, painted, even partially rebuilt. But if the foundation cracks, everything above it becomes unstable. That was what God's original design for marriage looked like. An unshakable foundation. No divorce, no exit clause, just one flesh, one covenant, one life. Then centuries passed. Israel spent 400 years in Egypt, not exactly a spa retreat. They absorbed a culture, breathed in its values, and slowly, without even noticing, their hearts began to harden. Hardness of heart is not something that happens overnight. It is a gradual calcification, like plaque building up in an artery. By the time Moses led the people out of Egypt, they were spiritually malnourished and legally chaotic. Divorce was already happening. Not through any formal process, not through anything resembling a certificate of divorce, but informally, abusively, with men simply pushing women out of their homes with no protection and no recourse. Moses did not invent divorce when he wrote Deuteronomy 24:1. He found it already happening and did something remarkable. He regulated it. He put walls around a fire that was already burning. Much later, when Mosaic law was studied by the rabbinical schools, by figures like Hillel and Shammai, they would debate endlessly what Moses actually meant. But in that original moment, Moses was not endorsing divorce as God's ideal. He was managing a broken reality with mercy and structure. Here is where it gets profound. And this is the part that most people miss entirely. God's creation design for marriage was never revised or replaced by Moses. It was paused, like a song interrupted by noise, but the melody never changed. When the covenant God intended from the beginning, permanent, faithful, life-giving, was always the target, even when human weakness pulled people far from it. A mentor once said that the best way to understand a rule is to ask why it was necessary in the first place. And when it comes to marriage and divorce in Scripture, that question unlocks everything. Why did Moses allow a written certificate? Why did Mosaic law address dissolution at all? Because people were already failing, and the law, in its extraordinary wisdom, tried to limit the damage while pointing back towards something better. And that something better is exactly where the story gets even more fascinating. Because what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy would one day become the center of one of the most explosive legal debates in Jewish history. If you have ever wondered why paperwork exists, here is one of the oldest and most human answers. Because without it, the powerful will always abuse the powerless. When Moses required a written certificate of divorce, the Sefer Keratit, he was not being bureaucratic, he was being protective. In a world where a woman had almost no legal standing on her own, being verbally dismissed by her husband was catastrophic. No document meant no proof of her status, which meant she could be accused of adultery if she remarried, stoned for a sin she did not commit, or left in a social limbo with no way to rebuild her life. The certificate of divorce was, in its time, one of the most progressive legal protections a woman could receive. It told the world this marriage ended legally, this woman is free and no one can touch her for it. Moses built 4 steps into the process: a justified cause, a written document, legal delivery into the woman's hand, and only then formal dismissal. And every single step was designed to slow things down. Impulse is the enemy of justice, and Moses knew it. Think of it like the cooling off period some countries require before a major financial decision. Brazil, for example, gives consumers up to 7 days to cancel a purchase. That law exists because humans make terrible decisions when they are emotional, and a forced pause can save lives, or at least livelihoods. Moses was doing something similar with the certificate of divorce inside the framework of Mosaic law. By requiring a written document, he was forcing the husband to stop, think, find a scribe, articulate a reason, and physically hand the paper to his wife. And that process could take days. And in those days, some men surely changed their minds. The Mosaic law was functioning here not as an endorsement of divorce, but as a legal break, a speed bump on the road to destruction. It was the covenant taking a practical shape in a broken world, trying to preserve what dignity it could for women who had no other recourse. Hardness of heart had made divorce inevitable in some cases. The certificate at least made it humane. What is remarkable is how this tiny document, this ancient piece of parchment, would become the subject of centuries of theological debate, political maneuvering, and eventually a direct confrontation with Jesus himself. Shammai's school would argue about what could justify it. Hillel's school would argue about how easily it could be given. Their rabbis would spend lifetimes on the question of what Moses really meant by that cause. And behind all of that intellectual energy was the same fundamental tension. Humanity keeps trying to find the line between what God originally designed and what broken people actually do. The certificate of divorce was Moses' attempt to hold both realities at the same time, to honor the covenant while managing its collapse. But as with every legal solution to a spiritual problem, it could only go so far. Because the real issue was never the paperwork. It was always the condition of the heart. And that is where the story takes a turn that not even the most learned rabbi could have predicted. 3 words in Hebrew, ervat davar, launched centuries of argument, political division, and theological war. It translated roughly as some indecency or something shameful. This phrase in Deuteronomy 24:1 became one of the most contested expressions in all of Jewish legal history. And the reason it mattered so much is that whoever controlled its meaning controlled the grounds for divorce in an entire civilization. Was it referring to serious sexual immorality, something that shattered the covenant at its core? Or could it mean something far more trivial, like a wife who embarrassed her husband in public or, as one ancient tradition suggests, burned his dinner? That gap between catastrophic moral failure and domestic inconvenience is not a small gap, it is a canyon. And into that canyon, the entire debate about marriage in Jesus' time had fallen. The original intent of Moses was clearly not to make divorce casual. Well, the elaborate 4-step process of the certificate of divorce alone tells you that. But language drifts, and when language drifts in law, abuse follows. Here is a real-world parallel that makes this tangible. Imagine a labor law that says an employee can be fired for just cause. Everyone agrees on the phrase, but no one agrees on what it means. One judge says it means theft or violence. Another says it includes chronic lateness. A third says it covers attitude problems. Suddenly, a law meant to protect workers becomes a tool to remove anyone inconvenient. That is exactly what happened with ervat davar in the centuries after Moses. The hardness of heart that had always been the real problem found a new address. Legal interpretation. Mosaic law, which had tried to slow divorce down, was now being used through creative reading to make it easier. Porneia, the Greek term Jesus would later use, points back to this same territory. Profound sexual betrayal, the kind that does not just wound a marriage, but severs the one-flesh covenant entirely. Jesus was not inventing a new standard. He was reclaiming the original one that had been buried under centuries of creative lawyering. This is why understanding the original meaning of words in Scripture is not just an academic exercise. It is a matter of justice. When someone reads Deuteronomy 24 and concludes that Moses approved of divorce for any reason, they are not reading Moses, they are reading Hillel. And when they read Hillel, they are reading a culture of convenience dressed in religious language. The creation design was never about convenience. It was about covenant, permanent, sacrificial, transforming. The indecency Moses referenced was serious, shameful, and grave, not a bad hair day or a disagreement about finances. That distinction mattered in Moses' time, it mattered in Jesus' time, and, quietly, urgently, it still matters today. Because the question of what actually justifies the ending of a marriage is not just historical theology, it is the lived reality of millions of people sitting in pews, in therapy offices, in lawyers' waiting rooms right now. And the next chapter of this story, the political corruption of marriage during the monarchy, reveals just how far things can drift when power enters the picture. Power has a way of bending everything it touches, including sacred institutions. When the kings of Israel began using marriage as a diplomatic tool, something quietly broke in the nation's understanding of what a covenant actually was. Solomon, famously, had 700 wives and 300 concubines, numbers that read less like a love story and more like a foreign policy portfolio. Each marriage was a treaty, each woman a seal on a political agreement, and each divorce, or dismissal, a potential act of war. The creation design, which had always pointed toward one man, one woman, one unbreakable bond, was being systematically dismantled by the very leaders who were supposed to model God's ways. Concubinage was normalized despite never being part of God's original plan. It was simply absorbed from surrounding cultures like so many other compromises. And when the people follow what their kings model, the result is not just moral drift, it is cultural collapse. The hardness of heart, once a private problem, had become a national policy. Then came the exile, the devastating Babylonian captivity that stripped Israel of everything: land, temple, king, identity. When they returned, the crisis was not just spiritual, but demographic. Ezra looked around and saw that Jewish men had married foreign women, and in a moment of national emergency, he made a dramatic and painful decision: mass divorce. Men were commanded to send away their foreign wives and the children born to them. This was Mosaic law being used not as a protection for vulnerable women, but as a weapon of ethnic survival. The certificate of divorce, which Moses had designed to protect abandoned women, was now being issued in bulk to protect a nation's bloodline. Historians and theologians still debate Ezra's decision. Was it right? Was it necessary? Was it merciful? But what is undeniable is that it left a deep scar in Jewish consciousness about what divorce could mean and do. It transformed a painful personal reality into a tool of institutional power. These historical traumas, royal marriages of convenience, mass exilic divorces, the normalization of concubinage, did not disappear when Israel returned to the land. They sedimented into the culture, shaping how people thought about marriage, about women, about covenant. By the time the 400 years of silence arrived, the period between the last prophet and the arrival of Jesus, Jewish society was carrying centuries of complicated, conflicted, sometimes weaponized views on marriage and divorce. The rabbinical schools that would later emerge, including those of Shammai and Hillel, were not debating in a vacuum. They were debating in the shadow of all this history, and the question of porneia, of what truly breaks a covenant, was already loaded with layers of meaning that went far beyond the bedroom. It carried the weight of kings, exiles, and survival, which is exactly why, when the Pharisees decided to use the topic of divorce as a trap for Jesus, they were not asking an innocent question. They were reaching into one of the deepest fault lines in their entire civilization. Imagine a city that has been without electricity for 400 years, and then someone turns the lights back on. That is something like what happened when Jesus arrived after 4 centuries of prophetic silence in Israel. But during those dark centuries, the scribes and rabbis had not been idle. They had been arguing, brilliantly, passionately, sometimes bitterly arguing. And the topic that generated some of the most heated debate was, almost inevitably, marriage and divorce. Two schools dominated the conversation, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, named after two of the most influential rabbis in Jewish history. Shammai held that divorce was only permissible in cases of serious sexual immorality, an interpretation that honored the covenantal weight of marriage and stayed close to the original spirit of Moses. His position was strict, demanding, and deeply unpopular, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. Hillel's school took a different approach, one that would have felt very familiar to anyone scrolling through social media today. Hillel interpreted ervat davar broadly, arguing that a man could issue a certificate of divorce for any cause, including, in one famous example, if his wife burned his food. Yes, you read that correctly. Burnt dinner as grounds for ending a covenant. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it was also enormously convenient for men in a patriarchal society, which is precisely why Hillel's view became the popular one. The hardness of heart that Moses had tried to constrain with legal process had found a new loophole: theological permissiveness dressed as legal interpretation. Women, meanwhile, were left in a position of chronic insecurity. Any domestic misstep could theoretically result in a certificate of divorce being handed to them with a polite smile and a legal blessing. Shammai's position protected women, Hillel's position protected men's options. History, sadly, I preferred the latter. What makes this debate so fascinating and so painfully relevant is that it was not just about marriage. It was about the kind of God people believed in and the kind of community they wanted to build. A community that takes covenant seriously treats its most vulnerable members differently than one that prioritizes personal convenience. The Mosaic Law had always been a reflection of God's character, and how people interpreted it revealed what they actually believed about that character. Porneia, the breaking of the covenant through deep sexual betrayal, was always at the theological center of this debate, even when it was framed in legal language about ervat davar. Shammai understood this. Hillel, for all his brilliance, had allowed cultural pressure to reshape theology. And by the time the Pharisees decided to bring the question directly to Jesus, the debate had become so politically charged that answering it at all was like stepping into a minefield, which, as it turns out, is exactly where Jesus was most comfortable. If you have ever watched a politician being asked a question specifically designed to destroy them, no matter how they answer, you already understand the dynamic of Matthew 19. The Pharisees approached Jesus with what sounds like a sincere theological question: is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? But this was not a seminar. This was a trap, carefully constructed, politically loaded, and designed to end Jesus' public ministry one way or another. If he sided with Shammai, he would alienate the masses who had grown comfortable with Hillel's permissive interpretation of divorce. If he sided with Hillel, he would undermine his own teaching on holiness and expose himself as just another populist rabbi, willing to bend the covenant for convenience. Either answer, in the Pharisees' calculation, was a loss for Jesus. What they did not account for was that Jesus was not playing the game they had invented. The question itself, for any cause, was a direct reference to the Hillel-Shammai debate, and every Pharisee in earshot knew it. This was not a question about whether divorce was lawful in general. That was already settled by Mosaic law. This was a question about the grounds, the interpretation of ervat davar, and by implication, a question about which rabbinical school Jesus would align with. When the political stakes were high, Herod Antipas had recently divorced his wife to marry his brother's wife, Herodias, and John the Baptist had been imprisoned and later beheaded for condemning that divorce. The last person who had publicly criticized divorce practices was now dead. The Pharisees were not just asking about theology, they were testing whether Jesus valued his life more than his convictions. The certificate of divorce had become, in that moment, a matter of life and death. This is the moment where a mentor would say, "Watch not what people ask, but why they ask it." The Pharisees' question reveals everything about their spiritual condition. Hardness of heart disguised as theological curiosity. They were not searching for truth, they were searching for leverage. And this is a pattern that repeats itself in every era, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in church committees, where questions that sound sincere are actually weapons in disguise. The creation design for marriage had been so thoroughly politicized by this point that even raising the subject required navigating a minefield of alliances, loyalties, and reputations. Shammai and Hillel had turned a sacred covenant into a legal battleground. And now the Pharisees were using that battleground to try to trap the one person in history who had the authority to end the argument entirely. What Jesus said next did not just answer their question, it dissolved the framework of the question itself. When someone hands you a trick question, the most powerful move is not to answer it, it is to reframe it entirely. And that is exactly what Jesus did in Matthew 19. And it was one of the most intellectually and spiritually stunning moments in all of Scripture. The Pharisees expected him to choose between Shammai and Hillel. Instead, he went somewhere neither school had thought to look, the beginning. Have you not read, he said, that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? With those words, Jesus bypassed centuries of rabbinical debate, the entire political minefield of his era, and landed squarely on the creation design, the original blueprint before any law, before any certificate of divorce, before any hardness of heart had entered the picture. It was a move of breathtaking clarity. The Pharisees had asked about Moses. Jesus answered with Genesis. This is the move of someone who is not afraid of the source. Well, most theological debates happen in the middle, in interpretations of interpretations, in traditions built on traditions. Jesus went to the original document, and what he found there was unambiguous. Marriage was designed to be permanent. What God has joined together, let not man separate. He was not abolishing Mosaic law or dismissing the certificate of divorce as if it had never existed. He was contextualizing it correctly. Moses permitted divorce, Jesus explained, because of hardness of heart. Not because it was God's ideal, but because broken people needed a legal framework to manage their brokenness. Divorce, in Jesus' framing, was never a gift or a right. It was a concession to human failure, a firewall, not a doorway. And this distinction between what God permits and what God designed is one of the most important theological concepts a person can carry into their understanding of marriage. Here is where it gets deeply personal and where a mentor would lean in and speak quietly. Every person who has ever been through a divorce, or grown up watching one, or feared one, needs to hear this not as condemnation, but as revelation. Jesus was not saying that people who divorce are worse than others. He was saying that the covenant was always meant to be something better, something so rooted in God's own character that human brokenness alone could not disqualify someone from understanding it. The creation design was not a standard designed to crush people. It was a vision designed to orient them. And Jesus, by going back to Genesis, it was not raising the bar. He was revealing that the bar had always been there, hidden beneath centuries of legal compromise and cultural drift. Porneia, the specific exception he would mention, was still ahead in the conversation. But before he got there, he needed the disciples, the Pharisees, and every reader who would follow to understand one thing clearly. Divorce was never the plan. And what comes next in that conversation would shake even his closest followers to the core. There is a word in Matthew 19:9 that theologians have argued about for 2,000 years, and understanding it changes everything. The word is porneia, a Greek term that Jesus introduces as the one ground on which divorce is permitted. And the first thing a careful reader notices is what Jesus did not say. He did not use the Greek word moicheia, which means adultery specifically, the act that, under Mosaic law, carried the death penalty. He used porneia, a broader term that encompasses profound sexual betrayal, the kind of sustained, devastating infidelity that does not just wound a marriage but severs the one-flesh covenant at its root. This was not a casual word choice. Jesus was making a precise theological distinction. He was not saying, if your spouse looks at someone else, you can leave. He was saying that there is a depth of sexual immorality, a destruction of the covenantal bond itself, that creates a rupture so severe that the marriage, in a very real sense, no longer exists as God designed it. Think of it like a bridge. A bridge can sustain enormous weight, storms, traffic, years of wear, and remain functional. But if the structural core is destroyed, what you have is not a damaged bridge. It is a collapsed one. No amount of paint or maintenance will fix it because the foundational integrity is gone. Porneia, in Jesus' usage, is that level of destruction, not a crack in the surface, but a collapse of the covenant's core. The certificate of divorce in these extreme cases is not creating a separation that did not exist. It is acknowledging one that already does. The hardness of heart that Moses addressed was different. That was people choosing to leave when the foundation was still intact. What Jesus describes with porneia is a situation where the foundation has been catastrophically compromised from within. This is why the exception matters and why it is narrow. It is not a loophole for people who are unhappy. It is a recognition that some violations are so severe they destroy the very thing the covenant was meant to protect. What is striking, and what reveals Jesus' character more than anything else in this passage, is his pastoral wisdom in the way he frames all of this. He is not running a courtroom. He is not issuing a verdict for every specific case. He is establishing a principle. Marriage is a covenant modeled on God's own faithfulness, and only the most profound betrayal can rupture what God has joined. Shammai had been close to this understanding, but had framed it legally. Jesus framed it covenantally, which is a completely different thing. A legal framework asks, "What did you do?" A covenantal framework asks, "What have you destroyed?" And that shift from law to covenant, from behavior to bond, is what makes Jesus' teaching on marriage so radical and so enduringly relevant. The creation design was always about more than rules. It was about reflection, marriage reflecting God's own commitment to his people. And that is the ground on which the disciples, hearing all of this, reacted with something very close to panic. When the disciples heard Jesus' full teaching on marriage and divorce, they did not respond with reverence or gratitude. They responded with something that sounds almost like complaint. If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. That reaction is more revealing than any theological commentary written since. These were men shaped by a culture in which divorce had become routine, where Hillel's permissive interpretation had made the certificate of divorce feel like a reasonable exit strategy from any marriage that got difficult. Jesus' words did not sound like liberation to them. They sounded like a trap. And that reaction tells you everything about how deeply hardness of heart had been normalized, even among those closest to Jesus. The creation designed for marriage, permanent, covenant-rooted, self-sacrificial, felt radical not because it was new, but because it had been so thoroughly forgotten. This is where Jesus makes his most important move of the entire conversation, and it is the one that gets quoted least. He does not respond to their panic by softening the standard. He does not say, "You're right, maybe I was too strict. Let's revisit this." He stands his ground, because the issue was never about stricter rules. It was about transformed hearts. The Mosaic law had always been an external framework trying to manage internal brokenness. Jesus was announcing something entirely different, the possibility of hearts genuinely renewed, capable of honoring the covenant not because a scribe required it, but because love had become their nature. This is the shift from law to grace, from compliance to transformation. And it is the only shift that actually works. A person with a renewed heart does not need the certificate of divorce as a safety net because they are not approaching marriage as a transaction they might want to exit. They are approaching it as a covenant they intend to keep. Here is the practical application that most people skip over. If you want a marriage that reflects what Jesus described, the work begins long before the wedding. It begins in the daily practice of covenant keeping in smaller things. Honoring your word, choosing generosity when selfishness would be easier, staying present when distance would be more comfortable. Books like Gary Thomas's Sacred Marriage or Tim Keller's The Meaning of Marriage are not just helpful reading. They are maps for people who want to build the kind of marriage Jesus pointed toward. The disciples were shocked because they were measuring the standard against their current capacity. Jesus was measuring it against their transformed potential. And that potential, the possibility of people genuinely capable of lasting, faithful, A covenant-keeping love is exactly what the early church would have to carry into a world that had even lower expectations of marriage than ancient Israel did. When Paul sat down to write about marriage in the Greco-Roman world, he was not working with a blank canvas. He was painting over a cultural backdrop that made even Hillel's permissive interpretation look conservative. In Rome, divorce was so commonplace that some aristocrats cycled through spouses like seasonal wardrobes. The Stoic philosopher Seneca reportedly said that women counted their years not by consuls, but by the number of husbands they had divorced. There was no deep reverence for covenant, no theological framework for the one-flesh union, no creation design informing the cultural understanding of what marriage was supposed to be. Into this environment, casual, a contractual, thoroughly transactional, Paul carried Jesus' radical teaching, and he did not water it down. In 1 Corinthians 7 and Ephesians 5, he upheld the high view of marriage that Jesus had restored, permanent, self-sacrificial, covenant-rooted, and modeled on Christ's relationship with the church. What Paul added, and this is crucial, was pastoral nuance for a genuinely new situation. What happens when one spouse becomes a Christian and the other does not? Mosaic law had not addressed this, and the certificate of divorce did not resolve it. Paul's answer revealed the heart of the gospel operating within marriage ethics. If the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay, stay. If they choose to leave, let them go, because God has called you to peace. Hardness of heart, in Paul's teaching, it could come from outside the marriage as well as within it. And the solution was never better paperwork. It was the transforming power of grace operating in real human relationships. The early church communities, often made up of people with complicated marital histories, people from cultures where porneia was normalized and covenant was unknown, were being called to embody something the surrounding world had never seen. People who kept their promises because they had been transformed, not because the law required it. And here is the extraordinary conclusion of this long, winding, profoundly human story. It ends not with a legal ruling, but with an invitation. The entire arc, from the creation design in Genesis, through Moses' certificate of divorce, through Shammai and Hillel's endless arguments, to through the Pharisees' trap and Jesus' radical response, all of it points toward a single, stunning possibility, that human beings, renewed from the inside out, can actually live the kind of love that God designed. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely, with growing faithfulness, deepening covenant, and increasing capacity for the kind of love that does not quit. The disciples were shocked. Paul's readers were challenged. And anyone reading this today who has ever loved someone, lost someone, or promised someone their life is standing in the same story. The question is never whether the standard is too high. The question is whether you are willing to be transformed enough to reach for it. Now, the real question is not what Jesus said about divorce 2,000 years ago. The real question is what you are going to do with it today. Are you treating your relationships like covenants or like contracts? Are you building a marriage on transformed love or on the hope that the exit door stays unlocked? Everything you just learned, from Moses' protective laws to Jesus' radical return to the beginning, is an invitation to live differently, to love with more intentionality, and to stop settling for a version of commitment that was never God's design in the first place. If this content stirred something in you, challenged you, or made you see your own story in a new light, leave it in the comments, because your perspective matters and this conversation is far from over. And if you want to keep going deeper into the truths that most people never discover, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what comes next will shake you even more.